When I first realized how big of a problem climate change really is, I immediately wanted to act. I wanted to do something about it. So I went and Googled how to solve climate change. As a machine learning researcher, I spent a lot of my time looking at data and reading scientific papers. So I was okay with having to do that. But I wanted to start out by just getting an overview, a big picture idea first, by, reading a few articles, watching some videos, and so on. I just wanted to know which solution seemed most promising and most worth working on, and, where we are generally. But it turned out that that's really difficult. There is a lot of misinformation, and particularly conflicting and contradicting information online. And as I later found out, it turns out the oil industry, the fossil fuel industry, invested billions into confusion to confuse the public by providing wrong information into injecting it, so that it makes it really hard for someone who isn't already an expert to really get to the bottom of it and understand it. And to say the least, that didn't make me happy. So long story short, over the last year, I was lucky enough to be able to work with over 100 scientists, illustrators, animators, community managers, and more, to build a platform that does provide science-backed but also easy to understand explanations of climate change and solutions to climate change. And today I want to share how this journey turned me from being quite pessimistic at the beginning about our future and where this is all going to reasonably cautiously optimistic. And because it's easier to memorize, I summarize these in 3 key takeaways. But let's start at the pessimistic end, where I started out too. This is an article from 1956. It was published in the New York Times, and it talks about climate change. So have we made progress since then? Well, if you look at this graph, it shows the yearly emissions of greenhouse gases of the world. And nope, doesn't really look like we made progress, does it? It's been going up since we started measuring, and there's no real end in sight if you just go from this graph. But really, I'm showing this for a specific reason, namely that we often look at the wrong data. We like to think of who emits how much and blaming each other, blaming various countries. But a much more useful variant of this graph is this. This one shows where emissions come from, not geographically, but per sector. And you can clearly see that 73% here, that's almost 3/4 of emissions, come from energy. Energy is electricity, heating, transportation fuels, and a few more minor things grouped together, which leads me to my first takeaway. There's a lot of discussion going on about minor things like plastic straws and really, you name it. We shouldn't be looking at that. We should be looking at 73% of the problem, and we should at least spend 73% of our attention on that. The other 27% matter too, but they matter 27%. And it's important to allocate attention based on that, I think, if we genuinely want to solve climate change. But it's not just important to look at the right type of data, it's also important to look on the right timescales. If we want to measure progress on climate change, it is highly important that we're able to track it in the short term. There's no way to hold any politician or business accountable over many decades. People just cycle through that too quickly. Presidents are in for, 4 or 5 years, depending on the country. Business leaders, they retire after 20 years. So if you want to hold anyone accountable, you have to be able to measure things on a, 1-year time scale or less. But that's not how we measure climate change at the moment. We look at these graphs that go hundreds of years into the past, and when we do try to measure progress into the future, we look at, how much did emissions increase this year compared to last year? But really, a 10% emissions reduction from last year to this year wouldn't matter much. It's just 10%. It's really not what we need. We need to get to 0. So unless we have a clear long-term plan to get to 0 emissions, we're not solving climate change. But again, this is the dilemma. We need to track it in the short term, right? So how would we do that if not by looking at how much did we reduce emissions this year and next year? Well, the answer is stop looking at the effects. Climate change and greenhouse gas emissions are derivatives, they're effects of what we're doing. And if instead of looking at these effects, we look at how much progress we're making towards being able to build a world that has 0 CO2 emissions, then we can track it in the short term. Let me show you what I mean here. Let's start with energy. This shows what the ratio of fossil fuels to other sources of energy that we use are. And if you look at this graph alone, and you look at these sort of slight, curve down, you might think, well, nothing's going to change, right? For good reason. You're just drawing that line. Okay, it's been a while now, and why wouldn't it continue? It makes sense, but it's not the complete picture, luckily. And here's why. If you look at what potential sources of energy we could be using, the first one is fossil fuels, and we don't want that because, it causes climate change. We've been there. Second one is nuclear. Third one is hydro. And the fourth one is, I bucket that together, solar and wind. They're very similar in that we can't control the weather. Now, let's look at what each of them has been up to over the last, few decades. And maybe we spot an indicator for the future. So here's nuclear. Let's start with nuclear. Firstly, nuclear is safer than most people think. It causes hundreds of times fewer deaths than coal does, and even oil and gas cause a lot more deaths. We still have to deal with the waste issue, and in some cases, some types of waste live thousands to millions of years, and we're probably going to invent some way to deal with that, but we don't have it yet. And then you find the other issue that you kind of have to pay for it. And nuclear is expensive. So building new nuclear plants is not a very lucrative option for many countries. Some are doing it, but most aren't. And if we could sort of reframe nuclear economics, that'd be fantastic. And then nuclear would be a great solution. But at the moment, it's just multiple times as expensive as alternatives, which makes it really difficult to justify building a lot of it. Okay, so what about hydro? Well, hydro actually is pretty good. Hydro is cheap. And, some countries like Norway, for example, run almost exclusively on hydropower. But the problem is that a lot of places in the world, a lot of countries just don't have enough mountains and rivers to do that. What about solar and wind, though? Solar and wind have been really popular in the last few years. But they haven't been popular before, and there's a good reason for that. Check out this graph. This is the price of solar photovoltaic panels over a few decades. It's decreased by a factor of 300. That's insane. Think about it. It got 300 times cheaper. So what does that mean, practically? You might think that solar panels are almost free now, but that's not what happened. What happened is that they started out being insanely expensive. Nobody would have ever thought about installing a solar panel on their roof. It's just, 300 times as expensive as it should be. But today, they're still not free, but they are the cheapest source of new build electricity for 2/3 of the global population. And that's massive, because if you don't have to trade off between the economy and the environment, the decision becomes obvious. But if you do, then you get a debate. You get those people that say, well, this is too expensive, we can't do that. And you get the people that say, but it's for the environment, we have to. I'm not saying one side is right or wrong, but history clearly shows that this causes delays and inaction. Nothing happens. But if we can align the environment with the economic side of things, it should work out pretty easily. That's what happened with solar. And in fact, you remember that ratio graph I showed you? This one change, the fact that solar panels and wind power similarly dropped in price dramatically, made McKinsey, one of the leading consulting firms in the world, predict that the deployment volume of solar and wind will absolutely skyrocket over the next few decades. And it's not just solar. If you look at batteries, for example, you see that their price has decreased by a factor of 7 over the last 10 years. And this will enable us to use the clean electricity we generate from solar, wind, hydro, and nuclear in our cars and trucks, and thereby get rid of the need for oil-based fuels. Now this leads me to my second takeaway, and it's that if we want to track short-term progress, and we have to, and we should be looking at the improvements of the tools we have, rather than the direct effects like the CO2 emissions, because that's delayed by many decades. The work that has been done on solar panels in the 1970s, 80s, 90s is only starting to be visible now as we start deploying them on a larger scale, and will only be really heavily visible in 2030, 2050. And my last point is that there is no plan B. Innovation is our only way out of climate change. And that's because billions of people still live in poverty. And if we want to give everyone a fair and equitable life, and you look at how much we consume in the rich countries and rich regions of the world, you give everyone sort of a baseline that's a little lower than that, but higher than what you find today in sub-Saharan Africa, you see that global consumption levels will increase. And that's not a good sign for, the theory that we should just reduce how much we consume. And yes, in rich countries we should. But globally, that's not going to change anything. This is not going to solve the problem. Think about it. If you reduced the world's consumption by half even, which we cannot do and shouldn't do because of the idea of giving everyone a fair and equitable life, but even if you did, you would only reduce emissions by half. And that would delay climate change by a factor of 2. It wouldn't prevent it. It certainly wouldn't solve what we already did, but it would just delay it. So there is really no plan B. And today, our society is very much based on fossil fuels. But with the technological innovation that we've been seeing over the last decades, and particularly the last decade, we're getting closer to being able to transition away from that. And as I said, energy is 73% of the problem, and I wanted to focus 73% of my attention on it. But there are other problems too. It's not as simple as that. For example, if we look at agriculture, you see that a lot of the emissions come from animal agriculture, particularly ruminants like beef and sheep. And there are solutions there too. We're certainly not going to invent a cow that doesn't burp methane, but there are alternatives, like for example this burger. It's very tasty, I've tried it. It has a good amount of protein, good amount of calories, good amount of fat in it, and absolutely no meat. The company that created this burger was founded in 2011. So this is all extremely recent. And in somewhat informal experiments where people gave kids these burgers to try them out, you found that they weren't able to distinguish between actual meat burgers and these meat replacements. They're healthy, they're tasty, and I would hope that kids are not politely lying about their estimate of what they're eating there. But really, this is again, all of these were cherry picked so far. Those are the problems we're doing really well on. There are harder ones. For example, steel and concrete production are extremely hard to solve and do without CO2 emissions. Aviation is really difficult. It's hard to build airplanes that don't use kerosene. But we are making progress on those fronts too. There's work on hydrogen airplanes, and there's work on processes of creating cement and steel with far lower to even no emissions. And my key point here is we should be focusing on exactly that. We should be focusing on the sub-problems that cause climate change rather than just the effects themselves. And when we think about who is contributing to solutions to climate change, we should be highlighting the people who invent these things. Because keep in mind, progress doesn't just happen. Things don't just get cheaper, better, faster. Every single step, every single improvement is someone's idea and someone's work. And the people who do this work, I think we should highlight those as the heroes of climate change, because they are the ones who actually solve the problems. Now, not everyone can or wants to become, an engineer, scientist, or sustainable business person or whatnot, but we can all take supporting roles. And if you look at things like the moon landing, not everyone was an astronaut, but everyone was cheering for the astronauts. There were a lot of supporting roles that made the astronauts' job better and easier and more effective. So if we all think about solving climate change the way we think about the moon landing, and we think about the people who develop solutions as the astronauts, I think we'll be making a lot more progress, and I think the world will be a lot more reasonably optimistic about our progress, because progress is happening. It is likely going to be too slow for a 1.5 degree target, and there is no reason to lie about that. But it is going to be better than what many people fear if we all keep working together on actual solutions. So if you want to act on climate change, I think that's how you should be doing it. Build the tools that solve the problem. Thank you.